The night Caelum was born, the old dog that had guarded the Dross family home for 12 years walked to the front gate, lay down, and never got up again. The servants found it at dawn, peaceful, as if it had simply decided it was done. Nobody could explain it. Nobody tried very hard. What kept the household talking for much longer was the baby. He had no aura. In the Empire of Vaelthorn, every living child was born with one. It was the inner fire that all Lycan people carried. A warm, glowing energy that lived inside the body and grew stronger with age and training. It could be seen by those trained to look for it. It could be measured. It determined everything about a person's future, their rank, their career, their place in the world. A strong aura meant respect. A weak one meant a hard life. No aura at all? That had a name. They called it Hollowborn. The midwife who delivered Caelum was a woman who had brought more than 400 children into the world. She had seen everything. She did not frighten easily, but when she caught the baby and he opened his eyes, far too early, far too clearly, and looked at her with gray eyes that felt ancient, like looking into deep still water, she held her breath and said nothing for a long moment. She never told anyone what she saw in those eyes, but she wrote it down once, in a letter she never sent. Caelum grew up in a house that did not know what to do with him. His father, Lord Edric Dross, was a man who cared very much about appearances. The Dross family was not the most powerful noble house in the empire, but it was proud. Having a hollow-born child was the kind of thing proud families did not discuss at dinner. So Caelum was kept away from guests. He was given the smallest room. He was handed his older brother's worn-out clothes without apology. He was fed, clothed, and otherwise forgotten. His brother Aldrin was everything the Empire admired. Tall, loud, golden-aured, and completely certain that he deserved every good thing that came to him. He was 17 years older than Caelum, and had never once looked at his younger brother with anything other than mild embarrassment. Caelum did not seem to mind. That was the strange thing about him. Most children in his position would have cried, or begged, or grown angry. Caelum did none of those things. He watched, he listened, he absorbed everything around him the way dry earth absorbs rain, quietly, completely, and with no visible reaction on the surface. And he read. The Dross family library was not large, but Caelum finished every book in it before he was 6 years old. After that he found ways, small trades, small savings, careful conversations with the kitchen staff, to bring new books in from the city market. He read history, he read war strategy, he read old philosophy and ancient theology and technical texts about aura theory that were normally reserved for advanced academy students. He read about the hollow gods, formless beings from beyond the physical world who fed on living energy, even though texts about them were technically restricted. He read everything about the Alpha King, Vorin the Unbroken, the greatest Lycan warrior in recorded history, the man who had united the entire continent 500 years ago after decades of war between the noble houses, the man who had faced the hollow gods when they first broke through the barrier between their world and this one and had pushed them back, had sealed them behind a barrier called the Veil at the cost of his own life. Before he died, witnesses said, Vorin made an oath. He said he would return when the Empire needed him most. People had stopped believing that story several generations ago. It had become the kind of thing grandmothers told children at bedtime, a painting on a temple wall, a speech made at imperial ceremonies that nobody truly listened to anymore. Caelum read the accounts carefully. He read the descriptions of Vorin's eyes. Gray, deeply gray. Several historians noted them specifically, not because the color was unusual, but because of the quality of them. Witnesses said that looking into the Alpha King's eyes did not feel like looking at a man. It felt like something else was looking back. Caelum sat with that passage for a long time. Then he turned the page and kept reading. When he was 11, the Imperial Academy sent the standard enrollment notice to every noble family in the region. Assessment would determine rank and class placement. The process was straightforward. A child stepped onto the aura stone, their inner energy was measured and displayed, and they were assigned a rank accordingly. Iron at the lowest, bronze, silver, gold, crimson at the very top. so rare that no living person in the current generation had earned it. Lord Edric considered not sending Caelum at all. Lady Bren, the family's head servant and the closest thing to a caring adult in Caelum's daily life, convinced him otherwise. It would look worse to keep the boy home, she said. Send him. Put him in the back. Nobody will pay attention. So Caelum went. He stood in a line of 43 children, all of them radiating color, blues and oranges and deep purples, some steady and strong, some flickering like new flames. He was the smallest person in the room. He wore a shirt that was too big in the shoulders, and shoes that were slightly too long. He stood still and waited his turn without fidgeting. When he stepped onto the aura stone, nothing happened. No color, no glow, no reading on any instrument. The examiner, a broad man named Master Thren, with a bronze aura and a talent for public humiliation, tapped the stone twice. He checked his instruments. He looked at Caelum with flat eyes. "Zero output," he announced, loudly enough for the entire hall to hear. "Hollowborn, no rank to assign." Some of the children laughed. Most just looked away, the way people look away from something uncomfortable. Caelum was placed in the servant track. This was a category that existed mainly so the Academy could tell noble families their hollowborn child had technically been accommodated. Servant track students sat in the back of every class. They were not expected to participate. They were not expected to succeed. They were expected to be invisible until they were old enough to find a suitable low-rank position somewhere in the Empire's enormous lower structure. Caelum sat in the back. He took notes. He never missed a class. He asked no questions out loud, but he wrote questions in his notebook constantly, careful, precise, often more advanced than anything being discussed at the front of the room. Nobody noticed. That was fine with him. 2 years passed. Then, during a session on advanced combat theory, everything changed in one quiet moment. The instructor was a retired general named Commander Hale, a hard, quiet man with a silver aura and 30 years of real battle experience. He was not like the other instructors. He did not perform. He taught. That day, he posed a famous strategic problem to the class. It came from a real battle, called the Grey Fields Campaign, 500 years ago. A Lycan battalion of 200 soldiers, surrounded on 3 sides by an enemy force of 1,200, with no path of retreat and nearly depleted aura reserves. "How do you win?" Hale asked. He did not expect an answer. He never received one. In 22 years of teaching this problem, no student had ever solved it. It was meant to teach the concept of unwinnable situations, that sometimes strategy was about accepting loss with dignity, rather than fighting toward impossible victory. 17 students offered answers anyway. Hale dismissed each in under a minute. Too simple, too obvious. Based on strength when there was no strength left to use. Then the quiet voice from the very back of the room spoke. It did not raise its hand, it simply began. Caelum laid out a 7-part strategy. He spoke slowly, clearly, without hesitation. He talked about reading terrain to funnel enemy movement into a single predictable path. He talked about deliberately suppressing aura output so enemy detection systems would misread the battalion's position. He talked about leaving the enemy's body alone entirely and targeting only its command structure. One precise strike at the people giving orders, creating confusion in a force too large to reorganize quickly. He talked about the psychological difference between an enemy that has been beaten and an enemy that simply cannot find its direction anymore. He stopped speaking. The room was very quiet. Commander Hyle looked at the boy in the servant's uniform at the back of the room for a long moment. "That," he said, "is how Vorin the Unbroken actually won that battle." Nobody laughed this time. After class, when the students had left, Hale walked to the back of the room. Caelum had left his notebook briefly on the desk. Hale picked it up. He stood there for a long time, turning pages. The notebook was not full of lecture notes. It was full of original analysis, battle formations that no current textbook documented, strategic theories that accounted for factors modern military doctrine had not considered, diagrams drawn in careful detail by a 13-year-old hand. Near the middle of the notebook, there was a single line written in a language that had not been used in 500 years. The old tongue, historians called it. the language of Voron's era. Hale had studied enough history to recognize it. He could not read it fluently, but he knew enough to understand, slowly, what the line meant. It said, "I remember this." He put the notebook down exactly where he had found it. He walked out. He said nothing to anyone that evening, but he began to watch. In Caelum's 14th year, the North went wrong. 3 frontier towns along the Empire's northern border were found completely empty. Not attacked, not burned, not disturbed in any visible way. Simply empty. Every person, every animal, every living thing, gone. The ground inside the towns was pale and dry in perfect circles, as if something had removed all life from it, the way you would drain water from a bowl. The Empire's leadership recognized the signs immediately, even though they had not seen them in 5 centuries. Hollow gods. The Imperial Council convened in emergency session. The most powerful Lycan soldiers in the Empire, including 2 warriors ranked at the theoretical peak of aura output, were dispatched north to investigate and contain the situation. They came back changed. Not injured, not defeated in any visible sense, but smaller, somehow. Their auras, previously so strong that being near them felt like standing in warm sunlight, were dim. Reduced. 2 of them could not speak clearly for days after returning. When they finally found words, the best they could offer was that the creatures had no shape, no sound, no scent. Only a kind of pressure that pushed against your mind and your energy at the same time, and took something from both without asking. 3 more towns went silent in the same week. Fear moved through the Empire quietly but quickly, the way cold moves through a building when someone leaves a window open. People in the capital stopped talking about politics and social rank, and started talking about whether the seals the Alpha King had died creating were actually holding, whether they had ever been permanent, whether the stories about Voron's oath were something more than a bedtime comfort after all. Caelum sat in his seat at the back of the classroom and felt something shift inside his chest. It was not fear. He had felt it before, a low, distant thing he had never found the right word for, something like remembering a place you have never physically been. It had been there since he was very young, quiet, patient, waiting. Now it moved. It was not loud, it did not announce itself, but it moved, and it was like a door that has been shut for a very long time, slowly, steadily, beginning to open. He picked up his pen and kept writing. 3 months later, one of the creatures came south. It was smaller than the ones in the north, a fragment, scholars would say later, a piece broken off from a larger whole, but it was enough. It moved across the Academy grounds on a still night, drawn, as such things were drawn, toward concentrated living energy. Hundreds of young Lycans sleeping in dormitories was exactly the kind of warmth these creatures followed. The Academy's protective wards, layers of aura-reinforced barriers built into the walls over generations, failed within minutes. The creature moved through the outer grounds like a cold wind with no source. 6 upper-rank students who encountered it first dropped where they stood, not dead, but empty-eyed, their auras snuffed out like candles in a sudden gust. Staff flooded the grounds, alarms sounded. Students were told to stay inside, lock their doors, do not go out. Caelum was in the library. He heard the alarms. He heard the shouting. Then he heard the shouting stop, which was worse. He stood up, closed his book, and walked out of the library into the open night air. He walked across the courtyard toward the place where the creature was. Witnesses later gave many different accounts of what happened next. They all agreed on the broad shape of events, but disagreed on the details, because the details were hard to hold in the mind clearly. Some said it happened fast. Some said it felt slow, like watching something move underwater. What everyone agreed on was this. The boy walked into the open center of the courtyard and stood still. He did not run. He did not raise his hands in any fighting posture. He stood the way a person stands in a place they have every right to be. The creature came toward him, and then something changed in the boy's eyes. The gray went deeper. It went older. It became the kind of gray you only see in the sky when the weather is about to change permanently. Not the gray of clouds, but the gray behind the clouds. The gray that has been there since before the clouds existed. And then Caelum released something. It had no color. In all of Vaelthorn's 500 years of recorded aura history, every documented aura had a color. Color was how energy was classified, measured, compared, ranked. The entire system was built on the assumption that aura had color. This had none. What it had was presence. It was the kind of presence that does not announce itself because it has no need to. It was like gravity. You do not hear gravity, you do not see gravity, but you feel it the moment it decides to remind you it exists. It came from Caelum in every direction at once, pressing outward, and it filled the courtyard, and it pressed against the creature, and the creature, which had extinguished 6 trained Lycan warriors without slowing down, stopped. And then it left. It did not fight. It did not struggle. It simply turned away from the boy and moved back the way it had come, crossing the broken wards and disappearing into the dark beyond the Academy's walls. The aura stones mounted in the courtyard walls, 4 of them, placed at the cardinal points, calibrated to measure any output up to crimson rank, cracked simultaneously. All 4, clean breaks through the center of each stone. Caelum stood alone in the empty courtyard. He looked at the cracked stones. He looked at the frozen faces watching him from every window and doorway in the surrounding buildings. He breathed evenly. Then he turned and walked back toward the library. He had 3 more chapters he wanted to finish before sunrise. By morning, the report had reached the capital. By noon, it sat on the desk of High Chancellor Marin, the woman who had governed the Empire for 20 years, in the continued absence of a sitting Alpha King, a position that had technically been vacant since Voron's death, and which nobody had been able to fill, because the throne of the Alpha King could not simply be appointed. It had to be claimed by someone the old laws recognized, and for 500 years, no one had been. Marin was 60 years old, sharp-minded, politically experienced, and deeply practical. She had survived in power by understanding people and situations clearly and quickly. She read the Academy's report 3 times. Then she requested everything on Caelum Dross: birth records, medical records, blood records going back 4 generations, a list of every book he had ever borrowed, notes from his instructors, any observed behaviors that had been recorded anywhere. She received it all and read through the night. Near dawn, she found the midwife's sealed account from the night of Caelum's birth. A letter, never sent, recovered from the old woman's belongings after her passing. The letter described the moment the newborn had opened his eyes too early, looked directly at her, and spoken, clearly, in a voice that should not have been possible from a body that young. 2 words: not yet. Marin set the letter down. She sat with the full picture for a long time. Then she made a decision. She would bring Caelum to the Imperial Palace. She would call it a scholarship appointment, a reward for distinguished behavior, which was vague enough to be believable. She would tell no one the real reason, because the real reason was complicated. If the soul behind those gray eyes was what the evidence quietly but persistently suggested, then the greatest danger was not the hollow gods pressing against the veil in the north. It was the 12 noble houses of the Iron Circle, powerful families who had built 500 years of wealth, influence, and control in the absence of a true Alpha King, and what they would do the moment they understood that the absence was about to end. The summons arrived at the Academy on a Tuesday morning. Caelum read it, folded it, set it beside his notebook on the desk. He picked up his pen. Outside the window, the sky over the northern mountains was pale in a way it had never been before his lifetime. Not the pale of winter, not the pale of early morning. The pale of something very large pressing, very steadily, against something that was beginning to give way. He had felt it since he was a child. He understood it now. He had built that barrier once, 500 years ago, and it had cost him everything: his body, his army, his name, a lifetime of living. And now the barrier was weakening, and he was 14 years old again, wearing borrowed clothes, sitting in the back of a classroom where nobody had expected anything from him for 3 years. He thought about the road ahead, what it would require, what it would cost, the political forces that would push against him, the people who had power and intended to keep it, the creatures beyond the veil that had been patient for 5 centuries and were not finished. He turned to a fresh page in his notebook. He had survived worse beginnings than this. He began to write.